holidays off, but I will not put up with people playing Christmas Eve music before our amazing American holiday.
Thanksgiving comes first. Thanksgiving is a season. I can't tell what holidays.
Well, ecclesiastically, yeah. Technically, you have Epiphany. You have to look at new places. You can wait until after.
All right, good morning, guys. Welcome to class. I hope everybody is doing well. Please remember, we're going to do a relatively short class. I want to talk for a little bit, maybe a half hour or so, about law, and then whatever time we have left, we can talk about the midterm for Friday. So if you have questions for that, and if not, fine, we can end a little early as well. But let's start with the idea of law and what goes on in the Middle Ages. This is one of the great contributions of the Middle Ages to who and what we are as a people. So I'd like us to start off, and I've got to find the page. I want us to look at the law as we understand it from King Alfred and what's happening there. This law that we find, oh, there it is. It's on page 427. This law that we find from Alfred is what we call common law. Common law is a distinctive form of law that only emerges from the experience of a people. That is, common law all emerges from the ground and goes up. And so it is never imposed by anybody else. We know from Tacitus and his history of the German people that the Germans had already had common law or some semblance of it before even the Christians arrive. And there's something powerful about the common law. So let's just think about this for a moment, what it is. The common law demands that we're all equal members of the community, hence common, right? That idea that we come together as a community. But it also says things like this, and where we as a people benefit greatly. It says that if we are arrested and if it goes to trial, we get to have a jury of our peers, 12 people, who sit over and make sure that the judge doesn't get out of hand. So the right to a trial by jury, it's older than Christianity, somewhere rooted in the deep pagan understanding of the Germans. And probably they chose 12 because they reflected the signs of the zodiac. But you can imagine if you're a Christian missionary and you come in and you meet the pagans and they tell you, oh, we picked 12, you would immediately think the 12 apostles, right? And it would seem like a very Christian institution. But there are other things that common law does as well. We are always presumed innocent until guilty in common law. And that's radically different. If you're arrested, for example, in Austria, which is Roman law, everything is against you because they argue that the police would have never taken the time to arrest you unless you were guilty. So the burden of proof is on the person to prove that they're not guilty rather than the law to prove that we are guilty. That's a huge, huge change. Or the fact that we can't have excessive bail is all part of common law. Or that we have the right to habeas corpus, our bodies. The government doesn't have a right to us at all. Those are all common law rules, and those are rules that are older than Christianity. And so here's what's amazing about these. Think about what common law is. Common law automatically looks to the dignity of the individual, even though it's pagan. And we have no idea who created common law. It comes from a culture rather than from a person. So you can imagine if I said, for example, this is the Socratic ethic. Well, we know it comes from Socrates. And so maybe we could dismiss Socrates. Let's imagine that we found out that he has some view we don't like. Like take Thomas Jefferson, for example. We could say, well, Thomas Jefferson believed in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh, but he was a slave owner, and therefore we don't take him that seriously. Right? We can do that with any person. Even Socrates we can find flaws in. We can't do that with the common law, because the common law doesn't belong to a person, it belongs to a people. And therefore, it has a kind of august element to it. And so even to this day in a court of law, if I cite the common law, I don't have to cite its origin, because all I have to say is it is rooted in time immemorial. That is, it's older than the memory of man, and therefore it carries great weight. That's incredible to think about that. So I'm going to throw out a really non-politically correct question for a moment. So just think about this. Let's say, and God forbid this would ever happen to anyone, but let's just say you're arrested, right? And you get the choice. You're either going to be arrested in Toronto or you're going to be arrested in Mexico City. You get to choose. Who in this room would want to be arrested in Mexico City? Frederick, really?
I could buy off the police.
Well, okay, that there are cultural things. All right, let's think about this for a moment. Mexico has a constitution that is identical to the U.S. Constitution. Word for word, it's the same. They don't have common law. They have Roman law. Roman law says that you are guilty until you prove your innocence. Toronto has no constitution. Canada is very proud of the fact they are an unconstitutional people. They're very proud of that. But they have common law. And therefore, you are innocent until proven guilty. Except for these two goofballs, I think that we would all prefer to be arrested in Toronto rather than Mexico City. And the point I want to make about that is that the kinds of things that we treasure as Americans, yes, we treasure the Constitution, and we should, but our rights and liberties that we understand them actually come from time immemorial. They're older, much, much older than the Constitution. And they're sacred in so many ways. Now, common law is under attack. One of the reasons that Britain has not worked as a part of the European Union is the European Union is all governed by Roman law, whereas the English are governed by common law. But the English, and I hate to say this because I love England, I'm an Anglophile, but the English have diminished their love of common law dramatically over the last 100 years. But we have too. So I'll give you an example. In common law, the most powerful institution by far is a jury. Now just think about a jury. 12 people come together. They actually have the right to suspend time and any law in a trial. They can basically say that law is unjust, and even though this person broke that law, we believe that the law was unjust, and therefore the person is innocent. And think about this, a person can be guilty only if there's not a reasonable doubt. If there is a reasonable doubt, the default is not guilty. And so in common law, we always presume it is better to let 99 guilty men go than to incarcerate one innocent man. I think that's beautiful. I know it's not always practical, but I think it's beautiful and ideal in what we're doing. But think about what that jury can do. It will never come back together in the same form ever again. The jury is a one-time, repeated institution, but its composition will never be the same, no matter how many times a jury meets. That's power. That's real power. But, and I just told you, in common law, we can nullify a law. This is called jury nullification. We have gotten so squeamish about that if you, as a prospective juror, even bring up jury nullification as a possibility, the judge will rule you in contempt of court at this point, and you can be fined and jailed for only mentioning jury nullification. That's how much we've started taking down the common law. And I truly believe that when we've really forgotten what common law was, we won't have our liberties anymore. Doesn't matter how great our Constitution is, we won't have that. So this is what Alfred is doing. Alfred here, and he's the first to do it, Alfred is the first English king, and he is great. Alfred, I mean, if you want a monarch, and I would assume that as Americans we don't, but if you wanted a monarch, Alfred's your monarch. He is the great Christian king, truly the great Christian king. And we'll talk more about him when we come back from your midterm, but just a great figure in history. He's the first English king, and if you had a chance to read his laws, notice what he does. He says, I, Alfred, cannot make laws. I can only judge the laws that I've inherited. That's all I can do. Now think about that. Imagine a government that does not make laws, that only ratifies laws that already exist. That's incredible. Again, a beautiful vision. And Alfred says, and I want you guys to know this term, Alfred says that he does this all in consultation with his witan. And the witan is what we would call Congress, or the British would call Parliament. So the king can only judge previous laws with the consultation of his witan. So notice the king's power. The king does not make laws, he only judges laws, and he judges them in conjunction with his counselors. Otherwise, it doesn't count. Again, that is a stunning image of what common law is. So I'll give you a modern example where common law works really well. I don't know how many of you guys, maybe if you've gone up to Saucy Dogs in Jonesville, you've taken the Hillsdale Road, you know that it curves twice, and then you end up in Jonesville. Well, for a long time, there was no speed limit between here and Jonesville. And the police decided they needed to put a speed limit on. But what they did, and this is all common law, they set up 2 radar guns. And what they did is they monitored for 3 months the speed, the average speed of people traveling between here and Jonesville. And at the end of that, they made the speed limit 35 miles an hour because that was the average speed people were driving. That's common law. Common law says we look at what the people do and we ratify it. It's not, oh, well, I think they should only be driving 20, and therefore I impose that. Right? That's not it. It says, look, the people have already shown us they drive 35 miles an hour. That's reasonable. That is our law. So that's what we do with common law. Common law is all based on the habits, the norms, and the mores of a people. And then it grows from our experience and becomes the law. So think about the opposite of this. Let's imagine that I am a tyrant and I impose the law upon you. Well, you don't agree with it. You're going to fight against it. Always, you're going to fight against it. And the only way I can enforce the law is by true force that I impose upon you. That is not healthy for a society. A society should not be governed by arms. It should be governed by culture. It should be governed by custom. That's our American tradition that comes from the English. And it is a beautiful, and I hope I don't sound bigoted here, but it is, for the most part, unique to the English-speaking peoples. And so New Zealand has common law, Canada has common law, Australia has common law, America has common law. The only other countries that have it are the Scandinavian countries, because they're German, and they too kept the common law for the most part. The Danes have done the best at keeping common law, but the other Scandinavians have it to a certain extent as well. But all of the rest of Europe is under what's called Roman law, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So, Helen?
So
Doesn't this only work on the presumption that the people, for the most part, act justly? Like, what if people just drove recklessly between Hillsdale and Jonesville and they made the speed limit 55, even though that's unsafe?
Well, so, I mean, there's a trust that the people are going to do what's right. And so they didn't, there were outliers. I'm sure there were people who were driving 55, and the radar gun probably caught that. But the average speed was 35. And so that's what they made it. So, and I'm sure there were probably old ladies who were driving at 15 too, right? But they made it 35 because that was the norm. And so, of course, there are always going to be outliers. And so the law has to exist to prevent outliers one way or the other. I mean, think about now on the interstate, right? It always states like maximum speed 75, minimum speed 40, right? Or even 55, depending. So they have to do it on both sides, above and below. And you guys know, no cop pulls you over if you're doing 78. They don't pull you over until you're doing 85. Then they pull you over in a 75, right? They pull you over at that point. But even they give you a little leeway because they know that, okay, this is the norm. This is what we're doing. So, but yeah, Helen, without question, there will always be outliers. There will always be criminals. So it's not utopian. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But it does recognize that a healthy body of people is governed by rules they themselves consent to.
To me, it seems to be making the assumption that most bodies of people are healthy. Like, what if just the mean or the average just happens to lie in vice, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's possible, but the English have had higher faith in us than that. Other peoples haven't, but the English have. So, and I think they've been correct for the most part. We have done really well with it. And I do think it's great. So, but you're right. I mean, there is always that possibility. Now, think about this. Well, we can get into details about it as well. But once, of course, the common law becomes Christianized, then there's a standard by which you judge the dignity of the person too. And so that has to come into effect as well. So, you can imagine a very difficult rule like, say, gay marriage or maybe abortion. Those become much, much, much more problematic when you're dealing with a people and trying to figure out, especially if you're dealing with a diverse people. And America, of course, we're a nation of immigrants. So we're always talking about much diversity, not just the Anglo-Saxons. I don't have a drop of Anglo-Saxon blood in me, even though I'm very proud to be an English speaker. Ethnically, I have none of that in me at all. But I'm still proud of that. But you can imagine maybe, and of course this is, think about this, what happens when Dearborn, Michigan wants to implement Sharia law? That's really hard, right? Can you do that? Can you not? I mean, I hope not, but that becomes a community norm then at that point as well. So it becomes a difficult thing to judge. So. Okay, so again, you guys don't get me wrong. I'm speaking very positively of it. I don't want to sound like a utopian. There are problems with it, definitely. So, Frederick.
Are there any other corollaries to the idea of common law in the natural or in the ancient world? For example, the Code of Hammurabi. Would that be analogous in some way?
Well, I think every people has a form of common law, right? You would always find it, especially more primitive people. You'll find it. Once people become civilized, they start losing it. And partly because when they become civilized, they become cosmopolitan. And so it definitely fits more for a rural agrarian people than it does for an urban people. So that, and I think that's part of what Helen was getting at as well. It gets complicated the more you have in it. But we'll see this, for example, and I don't want to spend too much more time on this today, but when we look at the Magna Carta, one of the things the Magna Carta stresses is that every person who crosses into England will be treated as an Englishman. And that, you think about what we're doing right now. We've got all of these illegals. We're not treating them as Americans. If we followed common law, we would have to. They would all have to go to trial. They would all have habeas corpus. But Trump has suspended that. He suspended common law when it comes to illegals right now. I don't know the right answer to that. I know what I would like to be true, but I also don't know if that's practical. So I think there are really complicated factors in all of that. But notice what's happened. We've gone beyond just a simple Anglo-Saxon people, and it's now so multicultural that it's hard to judge whose culture is correct. So that becomes complicated. Okay, good. Anybody else on this? Okay, well then let's look at Justinian for a sec. So, and just for a few minutes. So go back to Justinian. He's the last writer that you have in the Roman section. And notice what he says. He has now met with his counselors, but his counselors are not representatives of the Roman people. This is on page 275, bless you. These are not representatives of the Roman people, they are experts in law. And so Justinian sounds very much like what we would call a progressive in the modern world. Someone who wants to rule by legal principle of expertise rather than by the consent of the governed. And for what he does, and Justinian is a great emperor, don't get me wrong. He is, if you're looking for a good Christian leader, he is a very good Christian leader. But notice what he says here. Let's just jump to page 276 and look there, line 19 on 276. From old and erroneous sources may apprehend them by the clear light of imperial wisdom, and that your minds and ears may receive nothing that is useless or misplaced, but only what obtains in actual practice. So just like Alfred meeting with his group, Justinian has met with his group, but again, the difference is Alfred has met with his Congress, Justinian has met with his experts on legal theory. So again, he sounds very much like a progressive, and then a modern progressive. And then look down to line 35 on page 276. He says, what is all this being done for? It is being done by the light of imperial authority. In other words, all leadership resides in the emperor himself rather than in the body of people. He is the body of people. And he makes this explicit. If you turn to page 278, and there at the bottom of page 278, rule number 6, that which seems good to the emperor also has the force of law. For the people, by the lex regia, which is passed to confer on him his power, make over to him their whole power and authority. Well, that's amazing. Imagine what we would be doing in America. We would say that Congress does not represent us, but the president represents us. And we have done that more and more and more as we've gone along in American history. We have become much more presidential centric than ever before. In the 19th century, there were only 2 strong presidents, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. In the 20th century, there have only been 3 not strong presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and then Reagan was really restrained as well, even though he was a very powerful figure, but he restrained his own political authority as president. Otherwise, every president in the 20th century and into the 21st century has been incredibly powerful. Why? Because they're ruling like Justinian, not like Alfred. And nobody has been more powerful than our current president. And I don't mean that to be political. I'm not trying to take political sides. But we have never seen a president do what our current president is doing in terms of presidential authority. It's stunning. And of course, Congress is completely impotent. There are only 2 members of Congress who even challenge the president, Senator Rand Paul and Representative Massey. They are the only 2 who challenge his authority. And then you get the radicals on the Democratic Party, but they're not doing much. They're griping. So it's a very ineffective Congress. Whereas in the 19th century, Congress restrained the president all the time. And that has changed, especially since World War II. So, Vivian, please.
Do you think it has to do with the size of the country? Like, England was a much smaller country, so it could be governed more easily by common law when it's more of a shared community thing. And then, like, the Roman Empire and Roman law is such a huge
Right.
area that's so diverse.
Yeah.
The way that America
Yeah, great question, Vivian. Again, there's no question that common law works better for a consolidated culture, a small culture, and a farming culture. It definitely works better. Once we start becoming super diverse and we start urbanizing, it becomes much harder to have it. I still think it's possible, very much so, but I think it becomes difficult. And part of it is, for example, one of the things that we have been very successful about as Americans is we have integrated all kinds of different peoples, and we've convinced them that they should believe in common law. We have not been able to do that with the Muslim population. So that makes a very different instance, simply because it's much more difficult to integrate. If you're integrating Jews and Catholics into a Protestant culture, that makes a lot of sense. It's still hard. Protestants were always deeply fearful that Catholics would not integrate at all, but they did. They integrated extremely well, but they didn't think that would happen. They didn't know if Jews would integrate. Well, the same kinds of questions are now being asked about Muslims, but we've seen in places like Dearborn and Minneapolis that, in fact, many Muslims don't integrate in the way that previous immigrants have. So it could be a religious thing. Right, and I don't know that. I'm speaking as someone who, I don't understand Islam. I'm no expert on it at all. All I know is that we're not seeing the kind of integration that we've seen before with other immigrant groups. But yeah, I think your question is great. And there's no doubt that it does matter the more homogenous a culture is. Good. Okay, Frederick.
Do you think we can add to the idea of homogeneity something specific to the idea of a common morality as well? Because it seems like that's another fundamental underpinning for this idea of the common law to actually be practicable.
Yeah. Again, I think it's common, right? So there has to be a kind of common morality to it as well. And that plays a huge role in all of this. But again, typically as Americans, we've done an amazing job of integrating peoples. Better than anybody else. There's no question we're better than anybody else on that. But recently it's become problematic. Yeah, good. Okay, anything else, guys? Okay, does everybody understand? So Roman law, Justinian law, imperial law is always from the top. It is always imposed, and it is generally imposed by a person rather than persons. So the figure of Justinian, right? He is the Roman Empire. Whereas for us as Americans, we've said, no, we're best represented by the Witan, by Congress, in consultation with our leader. Our leader typically does not represent us. Congress represents us. And our law emerges from the bottom up rather than the top down. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, good. Any final questions on that? All right. Well, we took it to 29 minutes. So that's great. We have 20 minutes left. If you guys, please, it's up to you if you want to talk